Welcome, fellow YouTube traveler. If you don't know me already, I'm Baronen and I'm on a mission to learn art. For this video, I have done a study on painting different materials, and I want to share with you how I did it and what I learned. So without further ado, let's get into it. The first material I wanted to paint is brass. I chose this because I think it is one of the prettiest metals. To begin, I filled the sphere with a reddish brown and added some hue variation with another brown with more yellow in it. To sell the reflective nature of the metal, the top of the sphere needs to be darker than the bottom, since it reflects the light from the ground it stands on. So I paint a darker color on the top and a lighter color on the bottom. To finish off the color placement, I put a really dark color on the very bottom of the sphere where it touches the ground for some ambient occlusion, and a bright highlight on the top to represent the sun. Then I used a smudge brush to smudge the colors and achieve the gradients that I wanted to, and to add some texture. With the sphere done, I painted a ground for it to stand on. I imagined some sort of beige flat surface, painted on the shadow beneath the sphere, and ambient occlusion where they touch. To add some final touches, I used the smudge brush to break up the perfectly round shape, because I think it looks sort of unnatural and boring, and this is something that I do for all of the spheres in this study. The second one I wanted to do is rocks, because I think it is something that's really common and therefore good to know. To start this one, I began with a few different gray colors to get some variation in the rock. Then it was time to define the shadow family, which I did with a multiply layer and a dark purple color. I paint where the light won't reach, like the bottom of the sphere, and in all of the cracks in the rock's surface. Then I paint in the ambient occlusion, which is where the light has an even harder time reaching, like deeper in the cracks, and where the sphere will sit on the ground. With the rocks close to done, it was time to add some moss and other green stuff. I placed this where I think the moss would be able to find purchase, like on top of the sphere and in the cracks, for example. I paint the moss with a few different greens, again to get some variation. Then I use my trusty smudge brush to add some texture. After that, I wanted to add some highlights, so I used an overlay layer to paint where the shapes would catch the most light. With the sphere done, I painted a grassy ground for it to stand on, using basically the same principles as for the moss. Now on to the third. For this one, I wanted to try my hand at some wood grain, because I think it looks really cool. To do this, I started with a brown color that matches my reference. And on top of that, I painted a lot of wiggly lines in different brown colors, to try to make it look as close to the reference as possible, at the same time as I take the round shape in consideration. With the colors in place, is the smudge brush again, to make the color changes smoother. When I was happy with how the grain looked, I painted on the shadows using a multiply layer, and the light using an overlay layer. After that, it was time to paint the ground for it, and for this one I wanted to paint some sort of flat green surface. With the ground finished, I wanted to tie the sphere and the ground together a little bit by adding some green ambient light on the bottom of the sphere. For the fourth sphere I painted, I wanted to test myself a little bit by painting a chrome sphere without reference. I imagined the sphere in a desert with a bright blue sky, and since it is chrome, it would reflect the landscape around it. So I did my best to paint the landscape within the sphere, and tried to bend it to fit the shape of it. I started with painting the sky with a darker blue closer to the horizon and a lighter one higher up, which is the wrong way around and something that I always get mixed up. But I do correct the mistake a bit later when I eventually do look up some reference. For the desert landscape, I used a separate layer and went back and forth between them until I was happy with them both. The ground beneath the sphere would of course look identical to the one on the sphere, just flatter. And with that done, I added the sun. As a last step before the correction, I smudged everything in the sphere a little bit more to make it look a bit more like the sphere wasn't perfectly round. Now onto the correction. I need to switch around the sky so that the lighter color is closer to the horizon. This is because of the atmospheric perspective. I also painted a shadow beneath the sphere, since it would still cast a shadow, and then painted that shadow in the reflection to tie them together. To sell the chrome effect even more, we can make the parts further back in the landscape darker. Then I went a little bit back and forth, adding texture and smoothing things out. Now onto the one that I think came out looking most realistic. The leather one. As with the other ones, I began with painting a base color and splotching in a few different shades to get some variation in the material, taking inspiration from the different colors in the reference. With the base colors smudged, I also threw in some light scratches without smudging them to make them pop a little bit. With all of that done, it was time for light and shadow. Like a lot of the other ones, I use a multiply layer for the shadows, but for the light, I used a soft light layer instead, because I thought it looked better. I used a few of each to get the desired effect. I used one layer for the base shadow, one for the ambient occlusion on the bottom, and one for the ambient occlusion in the wrinkles. For the light, I used one layer for the wrinkles, one for the base light, and one for the scratches in the surface. And with the sphere done, I of course needed to paint some kind of ground for it, and I chose to paint the ground as wood, trying to mimic the way the wooden sphere looks. Now onto the one I think looks coolest. Let's call it the lava core. For this one, I began by filling the sphere with very saturated, fiery colors and blend them together to have a good base. On top of this, I create a new layer. On this layer, I paint smaller islands with a dark red color, making sure that the islands get flatter the closer they are to the edge, because of the perspective. Then I paint on the islands with progressively darker colors, closer to the middle of the islands, to show that the light from the lava beneath falls off gradually. Another thing that I have to have in mind when painting these darker colors is that the darker colors can go closer to the edge on the edges that face away from the middle of the sphere, again because of the perspective. With the islands done, I wanted to make the sphere look more irregular, to match the rocky texture and to match the large cracks in the surface where the lava shows. After that, I want to make the lava pop a bit more. I do this by painting with a yellow color on a color dodge layer with an airbrush, which gives me this glow effect. And with that done, I just needed to add a ground. And here, the sphere itself is the light source. And therefore I didn't paint a shadow on the ground in the same way as for the others. But I filled the entire ground with a shadow color and then erased where I wanted the light from the sphere to go. Now on to the 7th one. For this one I wanted to paint some sort of gemstone. This was by far the quickest one, but it was so much fun. To do this I chose a lighter color that I painted on the side pointing away from where I imagine the light source coming from. Then I chose a darker version of that color that I place on the opposite side of the sphere. Then I blend them a bit with my smudge brush. During this I make sure to leave the middle a bit transparent to show that you can see through it. On top of that I painted a highlight that is on the same side as the dark color. For the ground I painted some sort of grey flat surface. To make it look like the light is really shining through the sphere, I paint a pink light instead of a shadow underneath the sphere, on a soft light layer. And on the same layer I paint with the same color as the highlight, making sure to leave a small gap between the edge of the pink and the yellow light. For the last one, I wanted to paint something tied to what I've been doing the last weeks. If you don't know, during the last few weeks I've been working on a world building project heavily centered around dragons, and therefore I want to paint some dragon scales. To start this one I paint the hide that is underneath and between the scales. To do this I chose a few different browns and red colors that I blend together to get some variation. Then I paint a base shadow and a base light. After that I start to sculpt out the shapes that will be the scales on this sphere, making sure to think about how they will look on different parts of the sphere, taking perspective into consideration. With this done, I added some variation in the color of the scales as well. Then I painted the shadow and ambient occlusion to fit the scales as well. I also did the same for the light. And to make it complete, I painted a grassy ground for it to sit on. And that got me to this stage, but I'm not really happy with how it looks. So now I take some time to refine it, by first defining the edges of the scales a bit more, and also adding some more visual interest in the hide by adding wrinkles. Then I copy the entire group to do some overpainting, where I define edges more clearly and smooth out some transitions, and correct things that look out of place. After that, I add some highlights to show that the scales are a bit shiny. Then I add some more light to the grass to make it pop a bit more. Then I happened to look back a little bit to the leather one and realized I wanted to add some scratches to the scales. After that, I added some darker spots on some of the scales to add some more visual interest. And as a true last step, I went through the outer edge to make it a bit irregular and not as sharp, to make it fit in better with the other spheres. And this is what they all look like now that they're all done. Thank you so much for watching this video. It was so much fun to make. I really enjoyed the process of painting things that don't really matter, but still look kind of cool. I hope you enjoyed watching as much as I did making it. And if you did, consider giving the video a like. And subscribe so that you don't miss any future ones. And maybe you like the video that YouTube has chosen for you on your screen right now. With that said, thanks again, and I'll see you in the next one. Okay, bye.